Bushmeat refers to the human consumption of wild animals. It gets a bad rap, especially in this era of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's actually a complex issue with a lot of conservation implications, so it's worth examining in some detail. In this video, we will look at what bushmeat is, some of the issues that surround the practice, and some of the solutions that have been suggested. First, what is bushmeat? Bushmeat is a catch-all phrase for the meat of wild animals, but is most often used, especially in the media, to refer to the meat from animals killed in the forest and savanna regions of Africa and Asia. People in these regions have been hunting bats, monkeys, rats, snakes, and other wild animals for sustenance for hundreds of thousands of years, and the meat provides a valuable source of protein, especially in rural communities where farming domesticated animals is too expensive or impractical. The hunting and selling of bushmeat is also an important economic activity in some regions, providing a stable income for many people. Of course, here in North America, wild species like deer and moose are also hunted for human consumption, and there are plenty of people and groups who take issue with these hunts. But for now, we're going to focus our attention on the bushmeat trade in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa and Asia. But keep the North American practices of bushmeat consumption in mind, especially when we are discussing what to do about some of the issues associated with the practice. There are concerns that the scale of the bushmeat trade is getting out of control, and wildlife conservation groups have raised the alarm that the practice is causing harm to many wildlife populations. Globally, more than 1,000 species are hunted for bushmeat on a regular basis, at least a third of which are species of concern. The map here shows the spatial distribution of terrestrial mammals that are threatened by hunting pressures. This includes many of the great apes, pangolins, and forest elephants. As an example, one species that is often found in the bushmeat trade is the bonobo from Central Africa. Currently, they number about 20,000 in the wild and are considered to be endangered. They are primarily threatened by habitat destruction, but one of the most prominent and growing threats is poaching, with the animals often ending up in the bushmeat trade. In many parts of West and Central Africa, logging and mining roads, which are a problem in and of themselves, are cutting deeper into the forest, allowing hunters to reach areas that were previously too remote. Hunters are also now taking more animals than ever before, in part to help feed Africa's rapidly growing population, and in part because of the economic incentives to do so, as in some places, bushmeat is considered to be a delicacy, and people will pay more money for it than they would for other animal meat like beef or chicken. Some animals that end up in the bushmeat trade are also poached or killed illegally. In some cases, this is because the species itself is subject to regulations that mean it's not supposed to be killed, and in other cases, it's because the person was in an area where hunting is supposed to be prohibited, like a national park or other protected area. These conservation risks, coupled with the human health risks that we'll get to in a minute, has led hundreds of conservation and animal rights organizations, including the Animal Protection Party of Canada, Defenders of Wildlife, Panthera, and PETA, to write an open letter asking for the World Health Organization and other world leaders to take steps towards banning the sale of wild animal meat. Bushmeat has also been linked to a number of deadly disease outbreaks. For example, a number of Ebola outbreaks have been tied to the bushmeat trade in West and Central Africa, and it is likely that HIV was initially transferred to humans through infected bushmeat. The current COVID-19 pandemic has also been linked to wild animal meat, as the source of the virus is thought to be a bat in China. Bushmeat is generally very well cooked through smoking, frying, or boiling processes before it is eaten, which helps to kill any disease vectors in them, so there's generally little risk in the actual consumption of bushmeat. The real risk comes in the handling and preparation of bushmeat, which most consumers will do themselves. For example, HIV is thought to have been introduced to humans when someone cut their hand while preparing the raw meat of an infected chimpanzee. Concerns are also often raised over the way bushmeat is commonly sold in open-air markets. You've probably heard a lot of criticisms over China's wet markets where the bats infected with the COVID-19 virus were likely sold. In reality, though, it's important to mention that while these types of environments do carry risk for disease transmission, the wet markets in Africa and Asia are not so different from the farmers' markets of Canada and other Western countries. Despite the risks of disease, bushmeat remains a critical part of life in many parts of the world because of cultural traditions, necessity, and/or a lack of culturally appropriate education around the risks. At least one reason why bushmeat consumption continues is that, as we just mentioned with the last slide, the risk of running into contaminated meat is actually relatively low. For example, between the first recorded outbreak of Ebola in 1976 and the largest outbreak to date in 2014, the virus has only transferred from animals to humans about 30 times, despite the millions of tons of meat involved in the bushmeat trade every year. Because of this, it can be difficult to convince people that there is a risk to the handling of bushmeat. There may be an attitude that if Ebola or some other disease is such a problem with bushmeat, then someone would know a lot more people who have died from the practice. The problem is that while relatively rare, once a disease makes that jump to humans from an infected animal, the results can be devastating and can affect whole communities, countries, or even the whole world. For many people around the world, but especially in Central and West Africa and Southeast Asia, bushmeat is a critical component of people's diets. For many people, bushmeat is the only readily available source of protein, and bushmeat can be an important source of micro and macronutrients. Some studies have even shown that people who consume bushmeat are at a lower risk of anemia and other chronic health conditions. A concern that is often raised about bushmeat is that over the last couple of decades, in some regions, it has become less about providing a source of protein for people with no other options, and that the market is increasingly being catered towards more well-off people in urban areas who consume bushmeat as a delicacy, and who may view the consumption of certain species as a status symbol rather than as a critical component of their diet. In response to the very real conservation and human health risks associated with the bushmeat trade, a number of solutions have been suggested, including increasing access to affordable and reliable alternative sources of animal protein in the form of more typical livestock, or even farming some of the more popular bushmeat species. For example, cane rats have been successfully farmed for consumption in countries like Nigeria and Ghana. Others have suggested that outright bans on the hunting and selling of bushmeat is needed, while others still point to the need to strengthen the management of protected areas and enforcement of wildlife conservation laws. The hard part, though, is that these have already been tried and most have not been successful, the exception being some of the farming of cane rats and other similar species. In parts of West Africa where non-bushmeat protein sources are readily available, and in some cases even cheaper than bushmeat, people still consume bushmeat. Bushmeat is simply a critical part of many cultures, and completely getting rid of it is simply not an option at this point in time. This was readily apparent in Liberia during their last major Ebola outbreak in 2014. The government there banned the sale and consumption of bushmeat, but it was still readily available in virtually every market in the country. The result of a combination of cultural traditions, a lack of culturally appropriate communication about the risk, mistrust in the government, and the inability of the Liberian government to actually enforce their ban. Furthermore, experts say that strict bans on bushmeat would only send the market underground, making it harder to track and immensely more difficult to control and track any diseases that stem from it. We've actually been seeing this play out in the last couple of years as the result of the COVID-19 pandemic. In response to the pandemic, China placed a ban on the sale of bushmeat on all wild animal products. But what ended up happening was the creation of an online market for animal products, further exacerbating the issues as it increased the unregulated movement of bushmeat around the country and even around the world, rather than the more localized and relatively easier to track in-person markets. The lack of enforcement is also an issue when it comes to protected areas management and other wildlife conservation laws. Protected areas are really only as good as they are managed, and unfortunately, many protected areas in the regions where bushmeat is common are what is known as paper parks. Protected areas that exist on maps and in legislation, but that offer little to no actual protection on the ground, due to a lack of funding, community support, or enforcement power. One option that may be a bit of a compromise, but likely more doable in reality, is to target the control of hunting and trade of a select few species, specifically those that are most at risk to extinction or the most likely to be vectors of disease. One tactic that seems to have potential is the devolution of rights and authority over wildlife to local communities, providing communities with a vested interest in the sustainable management of the wildlife populations they live around. While this process is relatively new to West and Central Africa, where bushmeat is more common, it has been used to some success in East and Southern Africa, creating sustainably managed and carefully monitored industry around the trade of wildlife, which are designed by and for local communities. Overall, the bushmeat trade is a complex issue, and despite what some outsiders may want, it is likely to always be present in certain locations. If as a global community we want to successfully reduce the risks associated with bushmeat, including both its conservation and public health implications, we need to acknowledge the social dynamics of wildlife consumption and work with local communities that are most affected in order to find the solutions that work for them.